Tonight we got the Baseball Before We Knew It, which came out about 20 years ago or so, and was recently reissued with some new material in it. I think there's a couple new chapters and introduction and whatnot. And your moderator for the evening is the one and only Peter Mancuso. So, Peter, take it away.
Okay, for my anxiety. Okay, I want to, let me go backwards to 2004. And I was feeling very prideful that I understood without a doubt that Cartwright had invented baseball and that it was derived from the game of rounders. And I was so prideful that in 2004, I happened to be in Hawaii on business. And I visited my two friends, they're nuns at the convent of St. Francis in Hawaii. That's a very long story. I won't tell you how I got to meet them, but I did. And that convent was only steps away from the cemetery where Cartwright is buried. So I very proudly took them over and showed them the grave of Cartwright. You know, it's pretty illustrious. And I explained to them that this was the father of baseball. And, you know, Sister Candida and Sister Jovina swore to me that they walked in the cemetery quite often just for exercise, and that they would say a prayer at the grave of Father. You know, so we'll let it go at that. And then came along David Block and Baseball Before We Knew It. And I'm just going to tell you that I have a couple of general impressions of the book when I first read it in 2005. And that the first thing that really struck me was, like, unlike most baseball books, where the author has a very defined, you know, starts off motivated to tell us something of a story. This book started in a very different way. And that was one of the things unique about it. So I'd like to ask here if any of you have had a chance to read the preface, or the foreword rather, of that first book in 2005, written by Tim Wiles. I don't know. But so, you know, let me just say that Tim's introduction to that first edition, which was almost 5 pages, it's a pretty good size introduction, was very much focused on how David went about, how it came about that he did this book. And what was revealed, he revealed that David was really collecting. He was somewhat a collector anyway. And he was really collecting, and what he was collecting were kind of primary sources of references to early baseball and pre-baseball. And these sources were beginning to pile up. And they piled up to the tune that by the 20th edition, there's 171 pages, seven appendices, and hundreds of bibliographical entries of the sources that David has viewed. The second very most unique thing that Tim pointed out, you're back on, I say great. was that most of these sources, in fact, all of these sources, David had viewed with his own eyes. And thus, there's a certain purity there. There's something that is kind of extraordinary. And I think there's something like 8 or more trips to the UK that helped us between then and now, 2005, 20 years later, at least 8 trips to the UK, and all very exciting. And some of them really, one of them documented, of course, on British television, having to do with a find of a diary entry from the 18th century. So that is essentially what Tim brought forward in his introduction, was how did David Block write this book? And, you know, what were the mechanisms? What was the progression? And the progression went to collecting, to assembling, and then looking at what he had assembled and realizing that there's a story to tell you. And that's the progression. Unlike so many of these other books in my library, somebody has an agenda to write this book, they go about looking for things about certain things. And David was just looking at what was out there in the universe that had to deal with references to early baseball. What's also interesting is who wrote the introduction for the second book, the 20th anniversary book? Anybody? Okay, so John Thorne wrote that. And it's kind of interesting. John writes a shorter introduction, but a very powerful one, because he really talks in his introduction, not how David wrote his book, but 20 years after the origins of David's work and his first book, the tremendous impact that it made on baseball and on early baseball research. And it is a book that almost stands alone in terms of definitively going about and describing what the references are to how the game was developed over time. It's particularly in its early stages. So it's very interesting to compare the two introductions. That introduction of the first edition in 2005 gives the reader a sense of what he might anticipate or how this all took place, while the second introduction, just as powerfully, talks about the significance that this book has had in the last 20 years on baseball research and what people are looking at. Then David writes a preface for each edition. A preface to his edition that came out in 2005, and another one again for what came out in 2025. And these two different prefaces basically are different in a kind of special way. One is, in the very first preface, he talks a lot about the Doubleday myth, and how we kind of got, how it kind of took over, and for lack of some research for about 20 years or more, this became an accepted myth. The Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, was built around that myth. And that became, of course, the citadel of American baseball. He gives a glance in that first edition, in that first preface, of the type of research that he did. And it was arduous, and he humbly admits at the end of that preface that he is not immune to making any of these mistakes that have been made in the past, because he began to uncover through his own research that there were mistakes made in the past, and not every situation was a complete mistake. And when you read about Doubleday, the Doubleday myth, how it took off, if you read David's brother's excellent chapter, David was very wise and generous to have his brother Philip write the chapter on Doubleday and explain what was ultimately behind Doubleday being crowned the father of baseball, having invented it in Cooperstown allegedly in 1839. So it's a fascinating story, and it's one that was accepted even beyond the myth that I believed in Cartwright. In fact, I think a previous baseball commissioner, even not that long ago, brought up that he thought Doubleday was the inventor of baseball. So that's how powerful a myth can be, to give you an idea of it. A very important point that David makes is that first we're subjected to the Doubleday myth, and he credits Robert Henderson in his book Ball, Bat, and Bishop of effectively helping to dispel the Doubleday myth. And that's something that David, is able to give credit for in the book, and discussing, that Henderson was working, with what was existing at the time, that there was an alternate theory out there at the time that baseball had descended from rounders. And then with the intervention of some ancestors of Cartwright, the idea that Cartwright really was taking what was once rounders and making it the precursor to baseball. And that was the myth that I accepted, and most of us accepted that. I really truly believe that. I don't think anybody had particular insight. Some people really thought maybe that Cartwright wasn't worthy of the recognition that he got, but most people embraced him as the father of baseball by the time he was inducted into the Hall of Fame, which I believe was 1945. So what David begins to discover is that, yes, Henderson is correct in that he kind of pushes Doubleday out the door, which he properly did, and that what happened instead was he substituted one myth for another, and that's essentially what happened, in simple terms. Then in his preference, in the second edition, the 20th anniversary edition, David begins to modestly reaffirm his reliance on primary eyes on looking at the actual preliminary sources for the success of what that first edition brought is that most people viewed that what David had seen with his own eyes, those sources he had witnessed, had essentially, were documented, had essentially told the story. They were indisputable. They provided like evidence that was, beyond a reasonable doubt of what the sequence and the progression of baseball was. I like the idea that David presents in that preference of the fact that you had these two creation stories already, with first the Doubleday story and secondly the Cartwright story, and the dissension of from Rounders, and in a way, having those two stories greatly impeded future research of baseball, because why bother looking? You know the story. I very proudly stood in that cemetery in Honolulu and pointed those two nuns to that gravesite. And, because I thought I knew without a doubt that was the correct creation story. So what David does directly, really, because the conversation I had with him fairly recently, we talked about why it took until the 21st century to kind of restart research into this, and I think the answer to that question is that because we had these creation myths, that nobody thought anything else needed to be done, and that there was an understanding that Cartwright invented baseball, and it came from Rounders, and after all, it was seemed pretty clear by the evidence given at the time, and we all accepted that as a story. Another thing is that David points out not only his own research, but other research that kind of played a role in debunking the myths. One particularly he points out is Monica Nutrioni, and I can remember her presentation at Cooperstown a number of years ago. I see Joanne nodding her head. She was there and remembers it well too, right? That when she wrote her book about Cartwright, it has something to do with the subtitle is something like The Man and the Myth, or something to that extent. Cartwright was a kind of special personality in his own right. He had many, many, many personal accomplishments. But being the Johnny Appleseed of baseball was not one of them. And she kind of describes in her book and in her presentation at Cooperstown with great detail about what were the substantive issues. How did all of this happen? And there's some pretty damning evidence there that it was fraudulent, that his ancestors were going like above and beyond what he actually did, and began to spin another kind of a tale that gave him this complete notoriety. And they worked on that. I mean, Bob Henderson wrote his book around 1939, just at the start of World War II. And for a couple of years, of course, there were suspensions of any induction into the Hall of Fame during America's involvement in the war. And then by 1945, Henderson's work brewed long enough that by 1945, and with a lot of lobbying, for lack of a better word, by Cartwright's ancestors, he was in fact inducted into the Hall of Fame. And there you see a plaque that you kind of like scratch your head and say, well, I guess they didn't have that right. David also points out that both John Thorne and Larry McCray, particularly Larry with the Protoball project. The Protoball project brought a real all-new focus to the origins of baseball's origins. And it is Protoball. It's references that describe something being played that may or may not be baseball, but there's a lot of references, and you know that some of them are baseball, and eventually you know that they're kind of openly they're baseball. And what the two of them particularly accomplished, I think, and David thinks, I think also, I'm not 100% sure, but he gets to the idea that, in a sense, John Thorne and Larry McCray's Protoball project did a lot to take the focus off the New York Knickerbockers. It did a lot to kind of, yes, it's increased interest in them to some degree, that people were, you know, kind of more closely following what they were achieving, what the Knickerbockers were achieving. But at the same time, it brought into focus a whole bunch of early baseball being played around the Knickerbockers. But it wasn't exclusively them, because we were on our way to another myth. We were on our way to a myth that this was all about the growing, you know, activities of the Knickerbockers, and they, you know, in fact, today you probably still have people out there who lean more heavily than necessary or realistic about how much the Knickerbockers did. Yes, they did quite a bit, but there was a lot of other things that were going on that Larry's project and John Thorne in particular, and a few others, began to really disassemble the idea that all baseball sprang from the Knickerbockers. And I think that is another important development in the viewpoint of us, in a sense, that we have an understanding that this had a broader and more varied background than we thought, and take some of the kind of nipping the bud that the Knickerbockers were the originators of the game. So David says, what's he been doing for the last 20 years? Besides going back and forth across the Atlantic. Well, there's a couple of things that he's been doing. Of course, you know, we know that there's now a volume 2. There's a 20th anniversary edition to volume 1 of, you know, the original Baseball Before We Knew It. So obviously, some of his research and some of his activity were uncovering some things that had taken place in these 20 years, in the interim. And David was kind of tucking them aside to start to deploy them in this 20th anniversary division. But while he was doing nothing else, he was actually writing another fascinating book. And the name of that book is Pastime Lost. And it is a fascinating book that, although I don't know if it's as fascinating as baseball before we knew it, but is a fascinating look of early English baseball, which is not the same game that we, assimilate today as baseball, but it's something that is played almost throughout the United Kingdom. And there's actually references that David found of larger festivals where there's a game of early English baseball being played contemporaneously with a game alongside in another field where they're playing rounders. So it begins to draw that whole distinction that there's this is a separate thing altogether. And he titled his book Pastime Lost. I just want to get this right. The humble, original, and now completely forgotten game of English baseball. Well, I think it's only humble because it didn't garner the type of organization that we can think of today, as being or even in the 19th century, because when professional baseball finally got underway, that it had this kind of stature as the most important and so forth and so on. This was really a folk game that was played from the 17th century, late 17th century, all the way through the 18th century and in through the 19th century. So here was a completely different game that David documented and that we know today as baseball, the early English game of baseball. And it's separate and apart from rounders, and it's separate and apart from our modern baseball in a sense, which didn't come from rounders. And that is a huge contribution because I had asked David, why do you think it took until 1828 when rounders for the first time appeared in print of a book of childhood games in the United States? The first time it appeared in print in the United States is 1828. And yet there's dozens and dozens of references to baseball being played before that. And that's one of the things that John Thorne does in his introduction of the 2025 issue, is that he talks about the many or the American references to baseball, and how many of them are have now been documented and have been verified. Okay. So in his second preference, at the very end of it, David also includes a stop the presses announcement. And this I found very entertaining and very informative. And that announcement is made in 1823. And what it is, it's a single reference to an annual report that was made by a Connecticut school for deaf children. And of course, it's a description. It's an actual description. Perhaps, as David points out, the very first time in the English language that there's an actual description of baseball. Because what this 1823 annual report by the Connecticut School for Deaf Children does, it kind of describes playing baseball, describes how they played, what the basic rules of the game were, so forth and so on, and that these deaf children were playing it as part of their activities, as part of their, getting out there and getting involved and so forth and so on, and developing their skills. Of course, not to be overlooked is David's discovery of an 18th century, 1796, German book written for German educators, written in German and overlooked until David kind of unraveled it. And there's an entire section of the book that has to deal with particularly children's games. This has to do with activities for educators that they can have kids involved in and so forth and so on. And it's written primarily to a German audience of educators. And one of those chapters, when it's translated, describes the English boys' game of baseball. And not in the English language, but in the German language, it does what the Connecticut later on, that discovery, the 1823 discovery, does in German. It describes, for probably the first time ever, gives an accurate kind of description of how baseball is played. What goes on the field, the shape of the field.
What is it?
I'm sorry?
Sorry, I was interrupted here at home.
It's okay. Do you want to say anything, Tim?
Nope, just that I have my mic on by trying 3 different devices. So,
okay. Well,
thanks.
At least it's not a barking dog.
I have a dog, but she rarely barks. If the doorbell rings, watch out. So.
Okay. So that book, for the first time ever, really, really gets into the detailed description of playing baseball. And the book is written, as I said again, I believe it's in 1796. And it's invaluable in terms of documenting actually what's occurring in the game, how it's being played, how it should be played, and so forth and so on. And we have to know that David was able to put that in the mix, and that's such an important piece of primary research. Then there's 2 other things that happen in the second edition. David admits that he may have been arrogant. And what he meant by that was that there's a lot of terms that were being thrown around and being researched and being viewed by researchers as more and more people were kind of getting interested in the origins of baseball. A lot of it having to do with David's first book, but even before that all these references to base, B-A-S-E, B-A-S-S, B-A-S-E-T, or T-E rather, and a few other variations. Were they references to baseball? Or were they references to prisoner's base? Or some kind of a tag game where there was a large territory, not a home plate, but a large territory where there was a tag type game. You probably played it as a kid in scouting, where you ran around until you were flush and you know, tagged everybody, or you got tagged and you were a prisoner. And David had a lot of skepticism about that. And it wasn't undue skepticism. He was applying his standard of really that primary, my eyes on the original document only, the original reference only. Left David somewhat of a skeptic about base. And he was unwilling for much of the 20 years between the two books. He was unwilling to acknowledge or accept without additional information that base was in most instances baseball. And it took some convincing, but David also came to the same conclusions, and largely to do with the frequencies of these mentioning of base, and in some cases where actual scores are reported, that not something you would normally do in a tag type game of saying, well, the red team, won by a score, beat the blue team by, whatever, 20 some odd to 14. And the idea that this had to be something more akin to baseball as we knew it. So when you begin to apply the standard of, or if you begin to apply that base and all references and all words close to base, were probably not prison base. And one of David's observations is that it's very, very clear and always stated that when prison base is described, it's called prison base. But there's this body out there of instances where this name only base or some variation of it becomes in usage. And that in some of those issues, there's actually scores given and evidence that this cannot be prison base, that this has to be more of a bat and ball variant or something similar to baseball. And there's two pretty powerful George Thompson, who we all know as, well, David certainly knows him, and he's been at a Fred many times years ago. George is with the NYU library. He was a librarian at NYU for many years. And he was very interested in the Black theater of New York of the 19th and even the 18th century. And his research was really focused on that, but he kept coming across these baseball references. So he's, of course, most famous for his 1823 discovery, which happens to also be the same as the Connecticut school discovery that David made. But George is very famous for his documentation of baseball, actually B-A-S-E, B-A-L-L, being played in New York City on a kind of regular basis at Broadway and 8th Street. So he kind of documents that going on in the early 19th century, 1823. And he also uncovers in 1805 that base, B-A-S-S-E, is being played in New York. And this is the thing that kind of really got this discussion, under some steam, if I'm saying it right, or at least I inferred that what did all this mean? What did all this base and prisoners base mean? Well, for one thing that it meant that in 1778, a reference is made to base, B-A-S-E, by a soldier at Valley Forge by the name of George Ewing. And there's now a general acceptance that Ewing was talking about baseball and not talking about prisoners' base, because this is the kind of reference that was being made. And it's kind of interesting because my mailman and my very close friend for many years here and where I live is a Revolutionary War historian. Wrote a wonderful book about blacks in the American Army or the Continental Army that came from various states. That came up into Rhode Island, particularly when we were at the symposium there. They were very, very, he was very intrigued by that finding. So you have George Ewing's 1778 reference to base that's now accepted at Valley Forge, that's now accepted to be baseball. And you also have John Ray Smith's base, B-A-S-S, or simply base, at Princeton University in 1786. That is almost certainly, by further description, that's almost certainly baseball and not any kind of a prisoner's base game. So all of these things have kind of magnified the idea that there is references to baseball being made that at first were not recognized as references to baseball and were mistakenly identified as prisoners' base. And when you look at the list that David does provide of some of those historians who made that reference earlier, who made the reference that it might possibly be baseball itself. You got Harold and Dorothy Seymour. You have Robert Henderson, Tom Adelier, and a whole bunch of other baseball historians, history luminaries. So it's an addition. The second edition, he now believes with other evidence, such as the scores given and the alternate spellings, were more common than he thought originally. So that, in a sense, was a leap for him. And he kept an open mind and was eventually convinced that those references to base and bass and so forth and so on were actually references to baseball, many of them. finally, there is a story that David talks based on the Sinatra song, A Pocket Full of Miracles. And he talks about having a kind of a secret, well, he had this kind of secret Holy Grail that was the first reference that was openly made to baseball. And it's made in a small book, primarily for children. That was an 18th century book, first published in 1744 by John Newbery in London, England. And the book is a little pretty pocket book and very, very popular. And there was multiple editions that John Newbery published all the way. The last, I believe, was about 1870. And David, with a little bit of luck, not just luck, but a little research, he managed to get a copy of this book, a personal copy of this book, and particularly the portion of the book that dealt with children's games, including baseball. And David generously, so generously, gifted me some time ago this copy of the page. It's a single page for each game. And the copy says, baseball, 2 words, B-A-S-E, B-A-L-O. The ball once struck off, away flies the boy to the next destined post, and then home with joy. So this might be the very first, or this is believed to be in this book, this first edition, the very first mention of baseball as we understand it. And it's quite a find, quite an acquisition. I just want to close by saying or reading the final paragraph of David's book, because I think it says so much, not only about the book, but about David. Quote, I must confess to sharing with these would-be genealogists the belief that baseball merits a credible pedigree. Like them, I have been inspired by the game's larger-than-life importance to me and to many of my fellow citizens. Yet, I also yearn for a time when the enduring folk tales and misguided notions of baseball's beginnings will finally fade into the background, supplemented by a consensus vision of the game's evolution that is faithful to the details of history, in tribute to the pioneering work of Robert Henderson, and indebted to the many amazing discoveries of fellow early baseball historians. I hope with this book to edge us a little closer to that dream after so many missteps. I believe we are finally turning the corner and heading home in our search for the roots of our beloved pastime, national pastime. And that's David's Baseball Before We Knew It, and its 20th anniversary edition in a nutshell. Wasn't so much of a nutshell. Okay. All right. So normally, David is here, so you know that. And if anybody has any pressing question of him, I'm going to make this an exception and then make a very exciting announcement in another way. So the exception is that if you have a question for David, he is here. So please take advantage of that, if you might. Because I could talk to him about this for days. All right. So the special announcement is this.
Okay.
Okay. Somebody? Anybody? And okay. I don't know what happened to Bob.
Peter, go ahead with you've
Are
lectured
you there, Bob?
an hour, so might as well continue and finish it up.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just wrapping it up. So I'd like to say that on July the 2nd, coming up, we didn't, this is actually our last presentation of the spring. But on July 2nd, David's going to be involved in a very special book club, 19th Century Baseball Book Club situation where, event, where he will be fielding, we'll be having a conversation about these books. There'll be very specific questions, and David will supply some answers to those questions. And it is a special event. It's something that we don't normally do, but there's a kind of consensus among us that this is a very, very special book that has brought certain maturity to 19th century baseball research and origins research, for that matter. So we're going to really, push this thing not only to the 19th century committee members, but also to the origins committee members. There's a lot of overlap, but there's, a few people that are really focused very keenly on origins also. So that'll happen in the evening of July the 2nd. And I am, for one, looking forward to it, as I'm sure a few others are. Okay, are there any more questions or comments? David, do you have anything particularly?
I was hoping to get a little more feedback about the book from people.
So if anybody,
Somebody at the beginning had some question they wanted to ask.
Or a comment, I think they wanted to make.
Or a comment. Yeah, I don't know.
But I don't know where that person is.
okay. Anybody with any comments or anything about the book?
I will start, since my hand is up.
Okay. Oh, I see it. Okay.
David, I want to thank you so much for writing this book. It took me about, 10 minutes to figure out I had bitten off more than I could possibly chew reading this. But that was okay. The book is written just fine to read. But as I went chapter by chapter, I just kept going crazy about the amount of research it took for you to do what you did. But for me to understand it, it was difficult. It is not a page-turner book in my estimation, because it is so dense with information that I have no foundation for, that I probably read every paragraph twice just to make sure that I understood what I was supposed to understand. But it's a great book. I loved all the little stories you had about finding things and about how things were coordinated in the children's books, and stories about how this works with that. It was just great. and I thank you for doing it. I haven't read the second book yet, although I have it, because I just want to get into it and try and, like the first one, get through it so I can understand it better. So thank you again.
Thank you for your comment. It's very kind of you.
I would ditto that. Okay. So, I think that's probably what
Somebody
most
else?
people,
There's another hand up.
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Did somebody else have their hand up?
Yeah, you have to unmute.
Oh. You, Barbara?
No, it's,
Okay,
There you go.
my question is, in the late 30s, when they located the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, they were totally buying into the Doubleday myth. And
Yes.
I was wondering the extent to which Naismith's invention of basketball in the early 1890s, basically the Doubleday story applied in real life. I was wondering the extent to which that made the Doubleday myth plausible.
Well, you mean the sense that there was a true inventor of the game as opposed
Yeah,
to,
yeah, precisely. I mean, Naismith, true inventor of a game, Doubleday, true inventor of the game. That must have added some plausibility to the myth.
I kind of doubt it, only because the debate over baseball's beginnings began in the 1850s and was pretty hotly debated, for decades. And so the concept of an inventor was certainly not something that Henry Chadwick, for example, subscribed to. And he was a very, very influential person in that debate. So I don't think Naismith, first of all, even though basketball took off pretty quickly and became very popular very quickly, I still don't think it was very high in the consciousness of most baseball people in that time. It certainly wasn't, a co-equal sport or anything approaching the importance of baseball in the country at that time. So I kind of doubt the Naismith invention really impacted much.
I think after you read David's brother's chapter about Doubleday, and the chapter really exposes something that was not exposed by Spalding or anybody else, that kind of was even denied to the commission. There was a piece of information about Spalding's relationship or his relationship to a religious society in the later 19th century. I mean, he's already a retired general of the Civil War, hero of the Civil War. And he has this, affinity for this religious belief, religious cult, that Spalding's wife also had. So Spalding's wife was a member also, a kind of, high profile member. Now, Doubleday is dead by this point. He dies, while he's a member of this organization. And he's, of course, one of their most illustrious members. And Spalding never reveals this to the Mills Commission. And it's a kind of, a kind of like a silence that in a way, kind of spells out a fraud in a sense. That if they had taken that under consideration, it was really a strong motive to have, there was a strong personal motive of Spalding to have particularly Abner Doubleday because of his dual situation of not only being an American Civil War hero, but also the fact that he was a member of this very small elite cult headquartered in Southern California, that Spaulding's wife was a very significant member of. So that's a very, just one of the many things that this book kind of drags out into the open more. And it's essential to understanding maybe why Abner Doubleday, and it's a lot of reason behind it. So I hope you all have a chance, if you can, before July the 2nd. And I'll be getting out a few emails too about that event. And David will be available to really do this question and answer type of thing. And we field as many questions as you guys want to ask him. All right. David, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I look forward to the July 2nd thing. And if you have the opportunity to read the book, either of my two books, the first or the second edition of Baseball Before We Knew It or Pastime Lost, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have, or I'd be very happy to hear your feedback or your opinions about it, or if you have challenges to some of the stuff that I raise in the book, I'd be very open to hearing about it. So until July 2nd.
Thank you, David. That's a generous. Okay.